A single moment of pride, a routine stop on a quiet street, that's all it took to ignite a firestorm that would consume 2 police officers' careers. They saw a woman in a modest car and made a snap judgment. A mistake that would unravel their lives in the most public and devastating way. What they didn't know was that the woman they chose to humiliate held a connection to one of the most powerful men in the state. This isn't just a story of wrongful arrest. It's a chilling account of how arrogance can blind, and how a single phone call can become a weapon of absolute ruin. Stay with us as we unravel the story of how 2 cops handcuffed the wrong woman, and how her call to her husband didn't just end their careers, it erased them. The late afternoon sun of a crisp October Tuesday cast long skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns of Sycamore Drive. It was the kind of street that exuded a quiet, unassuming affluence, where the rustle of autumn leaves was usually the loudest sound to be heard. Dr. Isabella Rossi cherished these quiet moments, the gentle transition from a demanding day at the city's free clinic to the sanctuary of her home. Her slightly worn 10-year-old sedan, a practical choice she'd stuck with since her residency hummed along contentedly. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, expensive vehicles that typically lined the driveways of this neighborhood, but Isabella had never been one for ostentation. Her satisfaction came not from material wealth, but from the lives she touched, the people she helped. Today she was particularly weary. A difficult case involving a young child with a persistent, undiagnosed fever had occupied most of her afternoon, a tiny, fretful life now resting in her capable hands. She had finally managed to get the child admitted to the pediatric specialist unit at the main hospital. A small victory that nonetheless left her emotionally drained. All she wanted was a hot bath, a glass of wine, and the comforting presence of her husband, Jonathan. As she turned onto her street, a flicker of blue and red in her rearview mirror pulled her from her reverie. A police cruiser, sleek and predatory, was closing in on her. Her heart gave a little flutter of anxiety, the conditioned response of even the most law-abiding citizen. She checked her speedometer, 27 in a 25 zone. A minor infraction, certainly, but enough. With a sigh, she signaled and pulled her car over to the curb, the engine idling softly. The cruiser stopped a few feet behind her. For a long moment, nothing happened. Isabella watched in her mirror as 2 officers sat their conversation, obscured by the glare on their windshield. The delay was unnerving, a deliberate tactic she'd read about, designed to heighten a driver's anxiety. Finally, the driver's side door opened. Officer Frank Miller emerged. He was a man who wore his 15 years on the force like a suit of armor, thick-set and grizzled with a mustache that seemed permanently curled in a sneer of mild contempt. He moved with a swagger that suggested he owned the very pavement he walked on. His partner, Officer Ben Carter, was younger, leaner, with a sharp, eager face. He was the rookie just 6 months out of the academy, and he mirrored his senior partner's movements with a studied precision, his hand resting self-consciously on his holstered weapon. Miller ambled up to her window, his shadow falling over her. He didn't speak immediately, instead taking his time to peer into her car, his gaze lingering on the worn upholstery and the stack of medical journals on the passenger seat. License and registration. He finally grunted, the words clipped and devoid of any courtesy. Isabella reached for her purse. Of course, officer. Her hands were steady, her voice calm. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. She handed over the documents. Miller took them without a word, his eyes scanning them with a theatrical slowness. He looked from the license to her face and back again. Dr. Isabella Rossi. He read aloud, a slight mocking inflection on the doctor. What kind of doctor are you? I'm a physician, Isabella replied, keeping her tone even. I work at the Northwood Community Clinic. Miller exchanged a look with Carter, who had now positioned himself by her passenger side window, peering in with an intensity that felt accusatory. A smirk played on Miller's lips. A clinic doctor, huh? Driving this thing? He gestured dismissively at her car. Doesn't seem like a very lucrative practice, Doc. Isabella's patience began to fray. Is there a problem, officer? Was I speeding? We'll get to that, Miller said, his voice hardening. First, I want to know what you're doing in this neighborhood, Sycamore Drive. This is a pretty exclusive area. You don't exactly look like you belong here. The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. It was profiling, pure and simple. Her modest car, perhaps her olive skin and dark hair inherited from her Italian grandfather, had marked her as an outsider in their eyes. She felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks. I live here, she said, her voice now sharp with indignation. My house is 3 blocks down. Number 412. Miller chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. Right. And I'm the King of England. Ma'am, we've had a string of break-ins in this area recently. People casing the neighborhood in unremarkable cars just like yours. You fit the description. The description of what Isabella shot back. A woman driving home from work. A doctor. The description of someone who doesn't belong. Carter chirped from the other side, emboldened by his partner's aggression. Someone who looks suspicious. Isabella could scarcely believe what she was hearing. This was not a traffic stop. It was a shakedown, an exercise in intimidation. She had spent her entire day fighting for the health and well-being of strangers, and now she was being treated like a common criminal on her own street. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. I have done nothing wrong. I live here. My husband is waiting for me at home. You are welcome to follow me to my driveway, and he can confirm that. Oh, the husband? Miller drawled, a leering grin spreading across his face. There's always a husband, isn't there? What's he do? A plumber. A janitor at the clinic, maybe. The disrespect was staggering. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to rein in her temper. Getting angry would only make things worse. She had seen how quickly these situations could escalate from her work at the clinic, where she often treated the bruised and battered victims of police overreach. With all due respect, officer, she said, her voice a tight wire of control. My husband's profession has nothing to do with this. You pulled me over. You have my license, and you have no reason to detain me further. Either write me a ticket for whatever infraction you think I've committed, or let me go. Her assertiveness seemed to enrage Miller. His face, already ruddy, darkened to a dangerous shade of purple. You don't get to tell me how to do my job, Doc, he snarled, leaning closer to her window. You've got a real attitude problem. You know that, the kind of attitude that makes me think you've got something to hide. He straightened up and looked at his partner. Carter, I think we need to have a closer look at the vehicle. Maybe our doctor here has some unlicensed prescriptions rolling around in the back. Yes, sir, Carter responded with alacrity, his eyes gleaming with a kind of predatory excitement. You have no right to search my car, Isabella protested, her heart now pounding in her chest. You don't have a warrant, and you certainly don't have probable cause. Oh, I think I do, Miller said smoothly. Your suspicious behavior, your presence in a high-crime area, your evasive answers. That's all the probable cause I need. Now step out of the vehicle, ma'am. I will not. Isabella said, her voice shaking but firm. "I know my rights." Miller's face twisted into a mask of fury. "Your rights," he spat. "Your rights end where my authority begins. Now I'm not going to ask you again. Get out of the car. Now." He reached for the handle of her door. Isabella, acting on pure instinct, locked it. The click of the lock was like the snap of a trigger. "That's it," Miller roared, resisting arrest. "Carter, get her out of there." Before Isabella could even process what was happening, Carter had pulled out a retractable baton and with a sharp crack shattered her passenger side window. Glass sprayed across the interior of the car, peppering Isabella's face and clothes. She screamed a sound of pure shock and terror. Through the shattered window, Carter unlocked the door. Miller wrenched her driver's side door open and grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like claws. He hauled her out of the car and slammed her against the side of the vehicle, the cold metal jarring her bones. "You're under arrest!" He bellowed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and smelling of stale coffee. For what she cried, tears of pain and humiliation streaming down her face. "For being a stupid, arrogant bitch who doesn't know when to shut her mouth," he hissed, twisting her arm behind her back with a brutal efficiency. Isabella cried out in pain as her shoulder screamed in protest. He forced her other arm back, and she felt the cold, metallic bite of handcuffs closing around her wrists. The click of the cuffs was the loudest sound she had ever heard, a sound that seemed to echo the shattering of her dignity, her safety, her belief in the very fabric of the society she worked so hard to serve. He pushed her forward, forcing her to bend over the trunk of her own car. He kicked her legs apart, his movements rough and degrading. She was no longer Dr. Isabella Rossi, a respected physician, a loving wife, a resident of this quiet, affluent neighborhood. In the eyes of these two men, she was just another nameless, faceless suspect, another notch on their belt, another story to be embellished and laughed about back at the precinct. As Miller began a rough, invasive pat-down, running his hands over her body with a chilling lack of professionalism, Isabella's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare, a surreal and terrifying distortion of reality. But the pain in her shoulder, the sting of the glass on her skin, the cold steel on her wrists, it was all terrifyingly real. And through the fog of her fear and disbelief, a single clarifying thought emerged. A thought that was not of a victim, but of a fighter. A thought that was not of despair, but of a cold, gathering rage. They had made a mistake. A terrible, career-ending mistake. They had handcuffed the wrong woman, and now she was going to make a phone call. A phone call that would unleash a storm they could not possibly imagine. A phone call to her husband. A phone call to Jonathan Sterling, the United States Attorney for the Southern District. And as the first tears of outrage traced paths through the dust and grime on her cheeks, Isabella knew one thing with absolute certainty. By the time the sun set on this day, the lives of Officer Frank Miller and Officer Ben Carter would be in ruins. The unraveling had just begun. The world had narrowed to a tight, suffocating frame for Isabella. The rough texture of her car's trunk beneath her cheek, the biting cold of the handcuffs, the acrid smell of Miller's cheap cologne, and the throbbing, searing pain in her shoulder. Her mind, usually a precise instrument of diagnosis and logic, was a chaotic whirlwind of shock and fury. Humiliation was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. Found anything Carter Miller's voice was a smug drawl from behind her. "Just a bunch of doctor books," Frank Carter replied, the sound of him rummaging through her passenger seat a violation in itself. "And, oh, a stethoscope. Maybe she really is a doctor." There was a hint of uncertainty in the rookie's voice, now a faint tremor, that suggested the first tiny crack in his bravado. "Or maybe she stole it," Miller retorted undeterred. He finished his pat-down and hauled Isabella upright. "Let's see what's in her purse." He gestured to the bag lying on the driver's seat. Carter retrieved it and handed it to Miller, who unceremoniously dumped its contents onto the hood of her car. Her wallet keys, a lipstick, a pen, a small packet of tissues, and her phone skittered across the metal. "Nothing here," Miller grumbled, clearly disappointed by the lack of incriminating evidence. He poked at her wallet with a thick finger, flipping it open. He pulled out her driver's license again, and then her hospital ID, which had a smiling professional photo of her in her white coat. He stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. The smirk on his face faltered just for a second. This was her moment. The fog of shock was beginning to clear, replaced by a glacial calm. She had to be smart. She had to be strategic. "Officer," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it took every ounce of her willpower to keep it from trembling. "You are making a monumental mistake. I demand to be allowed to make a phone call." Miller tossed her ID back onto the pile of her belongings. "You can make a call from the station after you've been processed." "No," Isabella said, her voice dropping to a lower, more forceful register. "I am making a call now. I have a right to one phone call, and I am making it now." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. She was not pleading. She was informing him. Something in her tone, some note of absolute, unshakable conviction, seemed to give Miller pause. He exchanged a glance with Carter, who looked increasingly nervous. The adrenaline rush of the arrest was wearing off, and the reality of their situation standing on a quiet suburban street with a handcuffed woman who was articulate, composed, and now strangely intimidating was beginning to sink in. An elderly woman, Mrs. Peterson, from 2 houses down, was now standing on her porch, her arms crossed, watching the scene with undisguised disapproval. The audience was growing. Fine Miller sneered, trying to regain his footing of authority. "One call. But make it quick, and no funny business." He picked up her phone from the hood of the car. "Who are you calling your lawyer?" "No," Isabella said, a faint, cold smile touching her lips for the first time. "I'm calling my husband." Miller laughed, a short, barking sound. "Right. The plumber. I'm sure he'll be real helpful." He held the phone up. "Unlock it." Isabella instructed him on how to use the facial recognition. The phone unlocked. "The number is the first one on my favorites list," she said. Under J. Miller, a look of bored indulgence on his face, navigated to her favorites. He found the entry J. Sterling. He pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker, holding it close to her ear. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. A voice that was calm, measured, and radiated an effortless authority. A voice that was accustomed to being listened to being obeyed. "Isabella, are you okay? You're later than usual." "Hello, Jonathan," Isabella said, her voice now filled with a quiet, heart-breaking strength. "I'm on Sycamore Drive, just a few blocks from the house. There's been a bit of a situation. A situation. What happened? Are you hurt?" The concern in Jonathan's voice was immediate and palpable. I'm in handcuffs, Jonathan," she said the words catching in her throat, the full weight of her humiliation washing over her again. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. For a full 5 seconds, the only sound was the rustle of the autumn leaves. When Jonathan spoke again, his voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp, like surgical steel. "Tell me exactly what is happening, Isabella. Who is with you?" "2 officers from the Oak Creek Police Department," she replied. "An Officer Miller and an Officer Carter." Officer Frank Miller's smug expression had vanished, frozen on his face. He was staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. The name Jonathan was common enough, but there was something about that voice. "And why exactly are you in handcuffs, my love?" Jonathan's voice was dangerously quiet. "They said I looked like I didn't belong in the neighborhood." Isabella explained, her voice gaining strength with every word. "They accused me of casing the area for burglaries. When I asserted my rights, they smashed my car window and arrested me for resisting." Another pause, this one even more ominous than the first. Miller and Carter were now looking at each other, a silent, frantic conversation passing between them. The rookie Carter was pale, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Officer Miller Jonathan's voice crackled from the small speaker, now devoid of any emotion, a flat, lethal monotone. "My name is Jonathan Sterling. Does that name mean anything to you?" Miller's blood ran cold. Jonathan Sterling. The Jonathan Sterling, the United States Attorney for the Southern District. The man whose picture was frequently in the papers, the man who had taken down the infamous Donovan crime family, the man who held the careers of every law enforcement officer in the state in the palm of his hand. It couldn't be. It was impossible. This woman in this beat-up car. Sir Miller stammered his voice, suddenly a hoarse whisper. I don't know who you are." It was a weak, pathetic lie, and they all knew it. "You will," Jonathan said, his voice a low, chilling promise. "Now listen to me very carefully, Officer Miller. You are to take those handcuffs off my wife immediately. You are not to speak to her. You are not to touch her. You are to remain exactly where you are. I am 5 minutes away. The chief of the Oak Creek Police Department, Michael Donovan, is 7 minutes away. I have also taken the liberty of dispatching a team from the FBI's Public Integrity Section to your location. They will be there in approximately 10 minutes. Do you understand me?" "Officer Miller." Miller couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His mind was a maelstrom of panic. The FBI. The chief. This was a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. He looked at Isabella, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a suspect, but the architect of his doom. The quiet strength in her eyes was not arrogance. It was the calm assurance of someone who knew with absolute certainty that the full weight of the federal government was about to descend upon this quiet suburban street. "I asked you a question." Officer Jonathan's voice sliced through the silence, each word a drop of ice. "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Miller croaked, his hand trembling so violently he could barely hold the phone. "Good," Jonathan said. "Now put my wife back on the phone." Miller numbly held the phone back to Isabella's ear. "I'm coming, Bella." Jonathan's voice was soft again, filled with a fierce, protective love. "Just hold on. I'm almost there." The line went dead. Miller stared at the phone in his hand, his face the color of ash. He looked at Carter, whose youthful bravado had completely dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the handcuffs on Isabella's wrists, at the shattered glass glinting on the pavement, at the small crowd of neighbors that had now gathered their phones out recording. He had built his career on intimidation and bluster, on bending the rules and cutting corners. He had always believed that his badge gave him a kind of immunity, a shield against consequence, but in the space of a single 2-minute phone call, that shield had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. With fumbling, clumsy fingers, Miller produced the key to the handcuffs. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 attempts to fit the key into the lock. The click of the cuffs opening was as loud and final as the sound of a guillotine blade falling. Isabella rubbed her bruised wrists, her eyes never leaving Miller's. There was no triumph in her gaze, no gloating, just a deep, profound sadness, and an equally profound, unyielding resolve. In the distance, a siren began to wail, and then another, and another. The sounds grew closer, a chorus of impending doom converging on this one quiet street. The reckoning had arrived, and for Frank Miller and Ben Carter, there was nowhere left to run. Their careers were over. Their lives as they knew them were over, and it had all been sealed with a single devastating phone call. The 5 minutes that followed the phone call stretched into an eternity for Officers Miller and Carter. The world seemed to move in slow motion, every detail amplified, every sound magnified. The sirens grew from a distant whine to a deafening multi-layered scream that seemed to tear the tranquil afternoon apart. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, now lined the sidewalks, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and condemnation. Phones were held aloft, a silent digital jury recording every moment of the officer's public immolation. Isabella stood by her car, a solitary, composed figure amidst the chaos she had unleashed. She said nothing, her silence more damning than any accusation. She simply watched them, her gaze a heavy weight that they could not escape. She rubbed her wrists not as a sign of weakness, but as a quiet, constant reminder of what they had done. Carter was a mess. He kept pacing in a small, tight circle, his hands running through his short hair. "Frank, what do we do? What are we going to do?" he muttered, his voice a high-pitched, panicked squeak. "The FBI. Frank," he said. The FBI. Miller, however, had gone unnaturally still. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a grim, fatalistic resignation. The bluster and arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollowed-out man staring into the abyss of his own making. He knew police procedure. He knew the chain of command. A call from the U.S. Attorney to the Chief of Police was not a complaint. It was a death sentence. The FBI's Public Integrity Section didn't investigate minor grievances. They investigated serious civil rights violations, corruption, abuse of power. They were the headhunters of law enforcement, and they had just been sent on a hunt for him. "Shut up, Ben Miller," finally said, his voice flat and dead. "There's nothing to do. It's over." The first car to arrive was not a police cruiser. It was a sleek black sedan that pulled up with a quiet, expensive purr, parking directly behind Miller's patrol car, boxing it in. The driver's door opened, and Jonathan Sterling emerged. He was exactly as his voice had suggested, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with a presence that commanded immediate attention. His face was a mask of controlled fury. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the scene with a prosecutor's analytical gaze. They took in the shattered glass, the contents of his wife's purse strewn across the hood of her car, the red marks on her wrists, and finally they settled on the 2 officers. It was not a look of hatred, but of cold professional contempt. It was the look a surgeon gives a malignant tumor before excision. He walked directly to Isabella, ignoring the two officers as if they were nothing more than pieces of scenery. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly, his face buried in her hair. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Bella. I'm so sorry." Isabella finally allowed herself to sag against him, the rigid control she had maintained for so long, finally giving way to a flood of relief. She didn't cry, but a long, shuddering breath escaped her lips. Jonathan held her for a moment longer, then gently steered her towards his car. "Get in," he said softly. "It's over now." As Isabella got into the passenger seat, the first of the police cruisers screamed onto the scene. It was the chief's car. Michael Donovan, a veteran cop with a politician's smile and a reputation for being a ruthless protector of his department's image, burst out of the car before it had even come to a complete stop. His face was pale and beaded with sweat. He saw Jonathan Sterling standing by his car, his arm resting protectively on the roof, and his expression soured. He knew he wasn't here to manage a scene. He was here for damage control of the highest order. "Jonathan," he said, his voice attempting a tone of collegial concern that fell completely flat. "I came as soon as I got your call. What the hell happened here?" Jonathan turned to face him, his eyes like chips of ice. "What happened here, Chief?" he said, his voice low and carrying clearly over the wail of the approaching sirens, "is that two of your officers, Miller and Carter, decided to celebrate their afternoon by violating my wife's civil rights. They pulled her over without just cause, profiled her, because of her vehicle, accused her of being a burglar, verbally abused her. And when she had the audacity to assert her constitutional rights, they smashed her car window and assaulted her before illegally arresting her." He took a step towards Donovan, who instinctively took a step back. "So what happened here?" "Michael," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "is that you are about to have the biggest goddamn scandal this department has ever seen land squarely on your desk. And I promise you by the time I am done, you will be lucky if you are managing a mall security team in Poughkeepsie." Donovan's face went from pale to ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but at that moment, two dark, unmarked cars pulled up, their movements precise and professional. Men and women in dark suits and windbreakers, emblazoned with the letters FBI, emerged. They moved with a quiet, focused intensity, their eyes sweeping the scene, taking in every detail. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of no-nonsense authority, approached Jonathan. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice crisp. "Agent Sarah Jenkins." "You called Agent Jenkins?" Jonathan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for the prompt response. The subjects are the two officers standing by the patrol car. The victim is my wife, Isabella Rossi. She's in my vehicle. I want them processed. I want their patrol car impounded as evidence. I want their lockers at the precinct sealed. And I want a full investigation into their service records, their complaint histories, and any other case they have ever been involved in. I want to know if this is a pattern or just a particularly egregious lapse in judgment, though frankly I don't care which it is." Agent Jenkins simply nodded. "Consider it done." She turned to her team and began issuing quiet, precise orders. Two agents immediately approached Miller and Carter. "Officers Miller-Carter," one of the agents said, his voice polite but firm, "we need you to surrender your weapons and your badges. You're being placed on administrative leave pending a federal investigation." Carter, looking like a lost child, fumbled with his belt, his hands shaking too much to unholster his weapon. His partner, Miller, simply stared ahead, his face a blank mask. He unclipped his badge from his uniform, the small piece of metal that had defined his identity for 15 years, and held it out. It looked dull and cheap in the fading afternoon light. As the FBI agents began their methodical work cordoning off the area and taking initial statements from the growing crowd of witnesses, Chief Donovan approached Miller and Carter. His face was a thundercloud of rage. "You two," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Any idea at all? You didn't just assault a citizen. You assaulted the wife of the most powerful prosecutor in the state. You have brought the wrath of the entire federal government down on this department. Your careers are not just over. They are radioactive. You are finished. Do you hear me?" Finished. Miller didn't flinch. He just continued to stare into the middle distance as if he were already a ghost at the scene of his own demise. But Carter finally broke. His face crumpled, and he began to sob great gulping, undignified sobs of a man who has just watched his entire world collapse around him. Jonathan watched the scene for a moment longer, his expression cold and unforgiving. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, this casual abuse of power. He had built his career on dismantling it piece by piece. These two officers were not just a problem. They were a symptom of a disease he was determined to eradicate. He got into his car and gently took Isabella's hand. She was trembling, the adrenaline of the last hour finally catching up with her. He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It's all right, Bella," he said softly. "They can't hurt you anymore." As he pulled away from the curb, the flashing lights of the police and FBI vehicles painting the street in strobing blues and reds, Isabella looked back. She saw Officer Miller stripped of his badge and his gun being led to one of the FBI cars. She saw Officer Carter, his face buried in his hands, weeping like a child. She saw her own car, its window shattered, its contents, scattered a monument to the violence and violation she had endured. She felt no joy, no sense of victory, just a profound and weary sadness. But beneath the sadness, there was something else. A flicker of steel, a quiet resolve. This was not just about two rogue cops. It was about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had. The storm had arrived, and it had swept away the careers of two men. But for Isabella and Jonathan Sterling, the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. The days that followed the incident on Sycamore Drive were a blur of legal proceedings, media frenzy, and the slow, grinding work of dismantling two men's lives. For Frank Miller and Ben Carter, the world had shrunk to the four walls of their respective homes, the ringing of their phones from reporters they dared not answer, and the cold, formal language of suspension notices and impending grand jury indictments. The story had exploded in the media. U.S. Attorney's wife, assaulted by cops in wrongful arrest, screamed the headlines. The cell phone footage from Mrs. Peterson and other neighbors went viral, a damning, shaky cam record of Miller's aggression and Carter's complicity. The image of Miller yanking a terrified Isabella from her car, of Carter smashing her window, was played on a continuous loop on national news channels. They had become a national symbol of police brutality and arrogance. The internal investigation by the Oak Creek Police Department was a mere formality. Chief Donovan, in a desperate attempt to distance himself and his department from the firestorm, threw Miller and Carter to the wolves without a moment's hesitation. They were fired within 48 hours, their termination papers citing gross misconduct, excessive force, and violation of civil rights. The police union, usually a staunch defender of its members, issued a lukewarm statement expressing disappointment in the officer's actions and quietly withdrew its support. No one wanted to be associated with this level of toxicity. But losing their jobs was just the beginning. The federal investigation led by the relentless Agent Jenkins was far more terrifying. Jonathan Sterling had recused himself from the case to avoid a conflict of interest, but his shadow loomed large over the proceedings. The U.S. Attorney's Office was pursuing the case with a vigor usually reserved for mob bosses and terrorists. Agent Jenkins' team was meticulous. They interviewed every single person Miller and Carter had arrested in the past 5 years. They exhumed old complaints that had been buried by internal affairs cases of he said, she said, where the officer's word had been taken over that of a civilian. A pattern began to emerge, particularly with Miller. A long, sordid history of excessive force complaints, of racially motivated traffic stops, of falsified reports. He was a bully with a badge, a man who had been allowed to run roughshod over the community for years. Carter, the rookie, was seen as a willing accomplice, a young man too eager to follow the lead of a corrupt mentor. The investigation uncovered a particularly damning incident from 2 years prior. Miller had been involved in a violent arrest of a young black man, Marcus Thorne, who had been charged with resisting arrest and assault on an officer. Thorne had always maintained his innocence, claiming Miller had been the aggressor. But with no witnesses and a system predisposed to believe a veteran cop, Thorne was convicted and was currently serving a 3-year sentence. Agent Jenkins' team found a witness who had been too afraid to come forward at the time, an elderly man who had seen the whole thing from his apartment window. His testimony corroborated Thorne's story completely. Miller had not just assaulted him, he had framed him. The weight of this discovery was immense. It transformed the case from one of assault and civil rights violations against Isabella into a far more sinister case of systemic corruption and malicious prosecution. The grand jury, presented with the overwhelming evidence of the attack on Isabella and the framing of Marcus Thorne, returned an indictment in record time. Miller was charged with assault deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and most seriously, perjury and obstruction of justice in the Thorne case. Carter was charged as an accomplice, his defense of just following orders crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The fallout was not just professional, it was deeply personal. The hard karma the universe seemed to be dishing out was relentless and unforgiving. Frank Miller's life imploded with spectacular speed. His wife of 20 years, a quiet, unassuming woman who had stood by him through years of his brooding anger and quiet contempt for the world, packed her bags the day the indictment came down. She left a short, simple note on the kitchen table. "I can't do this anymore, Frank. I can't live with this man I see on the television. I don't know who you are." He came home from a meeting with his beleaguered court-appointed lawyer to an empty house, the silence a deafening testament to his failure. He started drinking heavily, the cheap whiskey his only companion. The friends he had on the force, the men he had shared beers and war stories with, stopped calling. He was a pariah, a contagion they were desperate to avoid. He'd see his own face on the news, his sneering, angry mugshot next to the calm, dignified face of Dr. Isabella Rossi, and he would be consumed by an impotent rage. He had been the king of his small world, a man of power and authority. Now he was a broke, unemployed, soon-to-be-divorced felon-in-waiting. His house, once a symbol of his middle-class success, was now a prison, and he was its only inmate. For Ben Carter, the unraveling was quieter, but no less devastating. He was young, his life just beginning. He had dreamed of being a cop since he was a boy, of being a hero, of making his parents proud. Now that dream was a pile of ashes at his feet. His fiancée, a sweet girl he had known since high school, gave him back his ring. Her tears a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I can't marry a man who could do that to someone, Ben," she had whispered. "I don't know you." He was consumed by a toxic cocktail of shame, guilt, and a festering resentment towards Miller for leading him down this path. He couldn't sleep. When he did, he had nightmares of Isabella's face, of the sound of the shattering glass, of Jonathan Sterling's cold, deadly voice on the phone. He had wanted to be a good cop, he told himself. He had just wanted to fit in, to prove himself to his senior partner. But in his eagerness to be one of the boys, he had lost his own moral compass. He tried to get a job as a security guard, but his name was now infamous. No one would hire him. He was branded a walking symbol of disgrace. His parents, a devoutly religious couple who had always preached the importance of integrity and kindness, could barely look at him. Their disappointment was a constant, suffocating presence. He had not just ruined his own life, he had brought shame upon his entire family. Meanwhile, Isabella and Jonathan tried to find their way back to normalcy, but it was a difficult road. Isabella returned to work at the clinic, her patients and colleagues rallying around her with an outpouring of support. But she was changed. The incident had left an invisible scar. She was more cautious, more wary. A sudden loud noise would make her jump. The sight of a police car in her rearview mirror still sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She became a reluctant public figure, a symbol of resistance against police misconduct. She was inundated with requests for interviews, for speaking engagements. She turned most of them down, but she felt a new sense of responsibility. She and Jonathan established a charitable foundation dedicated to providing legal support for victims of police brutality and funding community-based police reform initiatives. They were determined to turn their personal trauma into a force for positive change. The upcoming trial of Miller and Carter loomed over them all. It was set to be a media circus, a public dissection of one afternoon of madness and a lifetime of corruption. For Miller and Carter, it was the final, terrifying step in their descent into ruin. For Isabella and Jonathan, it was a necessary, painful chapter they had to get through to find closure. The wheels of justice, set in motion by a single fateful phone call, were grinding slowly. But they were grinding towards a conclusion that would be as devastating as it was inevitable. The karma was not just hard, it was absolute. The trial was a spectacle, just as everyone had predicted. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public all eager to witness the final act of this real-life drama. The prosecution, led by a sharp, ambitious assistant U.S. attorney, hand-picked by Jonathan's office, laid out its case with a brutal, methodical precision. They played the viral cell phone footage on a large screen for the jury, the grainy video, a stark, undeniable testament to the officer's aggression. They called Mrs. Peterson to the stand, the elderly neighbor who described the scene with a quiet, grandmotherly indignation that was devastatingly effective. They presented the findings of Agent Jenkins' investigation, a mountain of evidence detailing Miller's long and sordid history of misconduct. The star witness, of course, was Dr. Isabella Rossi. She walked to the stand with a quiet dignity that filled the courtroom. She spoke calmly and clearly, recounting the events of that afternoon, without embellishment or histrionics. She described her fear, her humiliation, but also her resolve. Her testimony was powerful not because of any overt display of emotion, but because of its restraint. She was a credible, compelling victim, a woman any member of the jury could imagine as their own wife, sister, or daughter. The defense was in shambles from the start. Miller's lawyer tried to paint Isabella as an arrogant, uncooperative driver who had provoked the officers. This tactic backfired spectacularly, making Miller seem even more of a bully. Carter's lawyer attempted a good kid, bad influence defense, portraying the rookie as a naive young man who was intimidated by his senior partner. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor forced Carter to admit that he had had multiple opportunities to de-escalate the situation, to question Miller's orders, and had failed to do so every single time. The most dramatic moment of the trial, however, came when the prosecution called its final witness, Marcus Thorne. He walked into the courtroom in a prison jumpsuit, a man who had lost 2 years of his life because of Frank Miller's lies. He spoke of his arrest, of the beating he had endured, of the despair he had felt when he was convicted. He looked directly at Miller, who refused to meet his gaze, and said, his voice thick with a pain that was still raw, "He took my life from me. He took my future. All because he didn't like the way I looked." In that moment, the trial ceased to be just about Isabella Rossi. It became a trial about every person who had ever been wronged by a person in power, every voice that had been silenced, every injustice that had been swept under the rug. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty, on all counts. The sentencing was a few weeks later. Ben Carter, sobbing and remorseful, was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. The judge acknowledged his youth and his secondary role in the events, but made it clear that just following orders was not a defense for violating a citizen's fundamental rights. Frank Miller, defiant and unrepentant to the very end, was sentenced to 15 years, 10 years for the litany of crimes against Isabella, and a consecutive 5-year sentence for the perjury and obstruction of justice that had stolen 2 years of Marcus Thorne's life. The judge, a stern, unflinching woman named Judge Alvarez, looked down at Miller from the bench, her expression one of utter disdain. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, "you took an oath to protect and to serve. You twisted that oath into a license to bully, to intimidate, and to brutalize the very people you were sworn to protect. You are a disgrace to your badge, a disgrace to your fellow officers, and a disgrace to this community. The damage you have done is incalculable. You have not just harmed Dr. Rossi and Mr. Thorne. You have eroded the public's trust in law enforcement, a trust that is the very bedrock of a civilized society. This sentence is not just punishment for your crimes. It is a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated, that no one is above the law. You are remanded to custody immediately." As the bailiffs came forward to lead him away, Miller finally looked over at Isabella and Jonathan. His face was a twisted mask of hatred. He opened his mouth as if to say something, some final venomous curse. But no words came out. He was a defeated man, a hollowed-out shell, his power, his authority, his very identity stripped away from him. The karma had come full circle. It was not just that he had lost his job, his wife, his freedom. It was that he was forced in the most public and humiliating way possible to confront the consequences of his actions. He, the great authority figure, was now a helpless prisoner of the system he had once manipulated with such arrogance. He who had profiled and judged others based on their appearance was now just another inmate in a drab, anonymous prison uniform. In the aftermath of the trial, real change began to take root in Oak Creek. Chief Donovan was forced to resign in disgrace. The new chief, a reformer from outside the department, immediately implemented sweeping changes, including mandatory de-escalation training, a new, more robust civilian oversight board, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. Marcus Thorne's conviction was overturned, and he was released from prison. He received a substantial settlement from the city, and with the help of the foundation established by Isabella and Jonathan, began to rebuild his life. He enrolled in college, determined to become a lawyer and fight for others who had been wronged by the system. Isabella and Jonathan found their own kind of peace. The scars of that afternoon would always remain a reminder of the fragility of safety and the ever-present potential for injustice. But they had faced it down. They had fought back not with vengeance, but with the unyielding power of the law. They had taken a moment of personal horror and transformed it into a catalyst for profound and lasting change. One sunny afternoon, about a year after the trial, Isabella was driving home from the clinic. She was in a new car now, a safe, reliable vehicle that Jonathan had insisted upon. As she turned onto Sycamore Drive, she saw a police cruiser parked by the side of the road. A young female officer was talking to a teenager who had been pulled over. The officer was smiling, her posture relaxed and non-threatening. She handed the teenager what looked like a warning, patted the hood of his car, and sent him on his way. Isabella smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. The world was not perfect. Injustice still existed. But on this quiet street, on this ordinary afternoon, a small measure of balance had been restored. The storm had passed, and in its wake something new, something better had begun to grow. The karma had not just been hard. In the end, it had been strangely, beautifully just. This story is a stark reminder that the abuse of power, no matter how small it may seem, can have devastating consequences. The officers thought they were dealing with a nobody, but their arrogance led them to a woman who had the strength to stand up for herself and the connections to see justice served. It's a powerful illustration of how karma, in its own time and its own way, ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. If this story of justice and consequence resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true-life cautionary tales. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. What did you think about the officer's fate? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one.